Welcome back to the latest installment of the Music History Project. Today's episode is Industry Heroes, Luthiers. Welcome to the Music History Project. We're your hosts. I'm Elizabeth Dale.
And Dan Del Fiorentino.
And Mike Mullins.
All of our content comes from the Oral History Program, which is sponsored by NAM, the National Association of Music Merchants. And that is a program that is over 3,000 interviews and constantly growing. If you want to check out any of our content or any of the other interviews that aren't featured, please check out our website at www.nam.org/library.
So I guess a good place to start today is getting a little background information and maybe a definition on what a luthier is. So to that, we turn to our expert everything, Mike Mullins.
I didn't realize I was an expert, but a luthier would be someone who makes stringed instruments.
Usually from scratch, right?
Yes.
Usually by hand.
They usually pick out the woods and all the materials and design it themselves. And some luthiers go on to have large companies that mass produce their instruments, and other luthiers are small and do each guitar by hand.
Those are known as the boutique luthiers,
yes,
as I recall. And interestingly enough, over the years, we have been so blessed to have interviewed several really well-known and influential luthiers for the NAM Oral History Program. And that's for which we will draw our content from today, as we do on all of our podcasts. So, Elizabeth, tell us a little bit about, maybe we could list the names of the folks that we're going to hear from in this podcast.
Yeah, today we're only hearing from 5 luthiers from our collection. That's Scott Baxendale and Bob Benedetto and Roger Bucknall and Wayne Charvel and finally Bill Collings.
Awesome. What a great lineup. I mean, all very influential guys, all started about the same time, late 60s, early 1970s as luthiers, and coming into their own and creating their own niches, which we will talk about as we go forward today. So what's our first step?
Well, probably the first step is reminding everyone that if they want to hear more content from other luthiers that aren't featured, they can jump on the website and look up the keyword tag luthiers, and they're going to see pages and pages of people that Dan has interviewed over the years that are luthiers. So make sure you check that out. But we're going to start our content today with we're kind of going thematic. So we're going to try and tell a story of what it takes to be a luthier. And so the first topic is hearing from Scott Baxendale. His interview was conducted back in 2003, in the summer of 2003, and he is going to be talking to us about his early exposure to building tools, woods, and just kind of the exposure to the shops in general and working with his hands.
So just a quick couple of words on Scott. Scott's probably best known to most people for his work building Mossman guitars. He started back in 1974 as a luthier and a repair and restorer of instruments for the likes of Johnny Cash, Billy Gibbons, Elvis Costello, Marty Stewart, among others. And just a few years ago, he started the Athens Luthier Academy. So he is actually teaching the art of making musical instruments as well. So let's get started with Scott Baxendale.
Well, I was born in Oklahoma. My dad was stationed in Fort Sill by Lawton, Oklahoma, and my mom was from Lawton. So they met there, and then growing up, we kind of moved around a lot in the Midwest, mostly in Kansas City. I lived there. I graduated from high school in Kansas City, and then I went to the University of Kansas, and I was trying to get a gymnastics scholarship because I competed in gymnastics. And then after college, or during college, was when I found out about Mossman guitars. And my mom actually sent me a article out of the Sunday paper, like the magazine supplement, like the Parade magazine. And it was an article about Mossman, about Stuart Mossman and Mossman guitars. And I, on a whim, just decided to write Stuart Mossman a letter and tell him I wanted to learn to build guitars. And at the same time, I was kind of going through kind of a breaking away from my parents, and I wanted to be a musician. And they said, well, you need something to fall back on. And I thought, well, this is the perfect thing. So I wrote Stu Mossman a letter. I went down for an interview. I dropped out of college. I moved to Winfield, Kansas, and started working. Got my first paycheck. Got an apartment. Then I wrote my parents and told them I wasn't in school anymore. And so I started at the bottom. I was a low man on the totem pole, kind of.
How big of the company was it at that time?
Well, this was in late '74, and there were 22 employees, and it was an old barracks from what used to be a military base in World War II. It was just a wooden Quonset hut that had been converted into. There were actually two of them. One was the factory, and the other was where Stuart Mossman lived. Part of it was his house, and he had some more tools and some of the machinery in the back of that. And it was on an airstrip, like Strother Field, which is in between Winfield, Kansas, and Ark City. And it was just a little small airstrip where they flew little planes and stuff. And then I just started working on guitars. I was making $2 an hour when I started, and
that was big bucks, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was minimum wage, whatever minimum wage was.
Well, what was your thought process when you were in college and you decided that this is what you were, did you have thoughts in terms of what your degree was going to be in and that wasn't what you wanted to pursue, or you just saw an opportunity with Mossman?
I saw an opportunity. I was kind of at a crossroads because the gymnastic thing didn't really work out as far as getting a scholarship. And I was in a fraternity house, and me and one of my friends, we played acoustic guitars, and it was right when Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young were really big. And every day after classes, we'd get together and jam for 2 or 3 hours, and we started learning. We were compelling each other to learn more and to become players, and we started just really getting into it. And then that was around the time when the Circle Being Broken album came out, and we got really heavy into that, and that led us into Doc Watson. And so we were like all excited about Doc Watson's music, and we started going to like the little folk festivals and music festivals around. And I remember going to Eureka Springs, Arkansas, and seeing Doc and Merle Watson and the Earl Scruggs Review and all that sort of stuff. And even though we had been heavily into, the rock music of the time, Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, we really got into this, Americana kind of music. And that was all about the time when I was really struggling with what I wanted to do in life. And I knew I wanted to be into music, but I didn't really have the book knowledge to go into the music program at the university. I didn't know how to read music or anything like that. I was just a guitar player. And so this opportunity came along, and it was just like a light bulb went off and said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And it worked out. I went down there, and I took to it right away. I picked up on I had the aptitude for it, I think. And I started in the finish department, which was kind of the worst job, sanding and spraying lacquer. And after a while, then Mossman's had a big fire, and after the fire, they rebuilt the factory, and then I was promoted to like an assistant shop foreman at that time, and that was like the following summer. And
so you were making $250.
Yeah, I think when I left there, I was making $350 was my wages when I left.
So it seems like a lot of these luthiers get their start not necessarily with their focus being on music and instruments, but more with working in a shop and building in general, and then they find their focus to music. Would you say that's correct, or the ones you've interviewed?
Absolutely, yes. And I think that their passion, all of them seem to be driven by their love of music as a player and saying, well, I wonder if my guitar could do this. And having that interest tends to lead them down the path of designing their own instruments, or at least modifying the ones that they have. And in the case of the 5 guys that we're hanging out with today, they all sort of had that same idea. Hey, let me see if I can do this a little bit differently. And then along the way, creating their own niche. And a great example of that is the next guy we're going to hear from is Bob Benedetto. Excuse me. He started in the early 1970s in the Bronx and moved down to Florida, I think, around 1976. And really had come to his own when designing and developing guitars for jazz musicians. Among them, the bebop hero to many, Chuck Wayne, Johnny Smith, Kenny Burrell, Bucky Pezzarella, many people like that. So Bob really became sort of the jazz musician's luthier. And so let's get our next segment up for Bob.
Lots of music. That's all we had was arts of some form, painting, singing. I didn't dance. I didn't sing. Did very little painting, but I was a woodworker. I would carve little miniature things when I was a kid, including little guitars. One of my uncles is a fine, classically trained painter. His brother, my other uncle, was the musician of that generation. So between the two, and my father being a cabinet maker, I had lots of music and woodworking influences.
So that's where the woodworking came from, is your dad?
Yes, that was my first exposure to cabinet making and anything really made out of wood.
And where did the music take you? Did you start having a desire to play yourself?
Well, I did, yes. One of the commonplace occurrence in our family were weekend gatherings with the uncles playing. Good food. My one uncle played mandolin. He was a violinist. Many years as a kid, became a mandolinist. Well, they played mandolin as well. The other uncle, the guitar player. So we had guitar and mandolin regularly, and that was my first exposure to music, live music. My uncle that played the guitar played an archtop guitar. And that's no doubt why I had interest in going in that direction. From those weekend extravaganzas, I had interest in playing the instrument, so I took lessons from my one uncle, Frank, who gave me guitar lessons. Started playing out in little bars and at little private affairs when I was about 11. And always wanted to make a guitar at the same time. As I was playing, I was also very interested in making them. So at that point in my life, I started making little miniature guitars from scraps of wood that I would find around the table saw in my father's little workshop. And yeah.
That's interesting. What were some of those shaped like? Your own design, or did you emulate other styles?
Well, the first one was a copy of my uncle's guitar, which was a small-bodied, 16-inch bodied Gretsch, an archtop F-hole Gretsch, Sunburst. I don't know what the model name was. I don't remember. But anyway, that was my first little miniature.
Next up, we're going to hear from Roger Bucknall, who founded Filed Guitars in 1973 in Filed, United Kingdom. And this interview is from 2011.
One of the things that's fascinating to me about people in the music industry is their passion for music. And I wonder for you if we could trace a little bit about how that got developed.
Well, it did develop because it didn't come with me out of the womb. Because I think, first of all, I was interested mostly in making things. The music came later on. And somewhere in between, a strange thing happened. I actually made a guitar before I even picked one up. When I was about 9 years old, I made a guitar in my father's workshop because my dad was a mad keen DIY man. And I made a guitar. And only a year or two later did I actually take interest in playing the things. My sisters had been forced to play piano and learn violin, but I was the youngest. And I was the boy, I was the youngest and left alone to do whatever I wanted, and I decided to make things. I was never taught to play an instrument, but my sister's boyfriends all played guitar. So once I started taking an interest in guitar, I had a lot of people just pushing me along and showing me things. And then occasionally I'd come out of my bedroom when my sisters had the boyfriends downstairs, and I'd come out and show them the latest piece that I'd learned and wait for the applause, which was great.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. Over the years, so what's actually happened with me is the interest in making things has been paramount. It started off that way. My dad had a workshop and I used his tools, then I started getting my own. Then I became interested in playing guitar. So the two things came together and I started making guitars quite seriously when I was about 13, even though I'd started a bit earlier than that. And then I got really involved in the music. I used to go to the folk clubs, and the first records I bought were the Shadows' Greatest Hits, which over in the UK was the thing at the time. And David Graham, folk blues and beyond. Now, although I didn't know then what was happening, but round about 1960, lots of people in the UK were taking inspiration for music from all over the world and transferring it to guitar, particularly steel-string guitar, which is where my interests have laid. David Graham was taking jazz and blues, mostly from America, but also Far Eastern music, and putting onto the steel string acoustic guitar, which is, like it or not, is really an American instrument. And let me see, John Renbourn was taking Elizabethan music, lute music, and put it onto steel string guitar. John James in Wales was taking ragtime piano music and put it onto steel string guitar with the help of people like Stephen Grossman. Archie Fisher was taking influence from all over the world in song and using the guitars and the accompaniment. And there's so many other people doing the same sort of thing in this country, using what really was an American instrument. Even though the history of the guitar is European and maybe even Middle Eastern, with the nylon string guitar and the cittern and the guitarra, there's even an English guitar and a Scottish guitar. But there's no doubt that the guitar as we use it nowadays has so much American influence in it. We have to call it in fact, it's probably your national instrument, isn't it? In the way that Scotland has the bagpipes, America has got the guitar. England, what do we have? We don't have much in England, I'm afraid. The melodeon, which isn't an English instrument, the concertina, the English concertina. What a shame. But for me, these things started coming together. The manufacturing of things, the influence of my sister's friends, the interest in the music, and then I started to get the training that went along with all this. I went to a technical school, which gave me all sorts of technical skills in using machines. I'm using my hands in metal, in wood, drawing, engineering drawing. I did a university degree in mechanical engineering. I studied musical acoustics at a university as well. My only ever real job, apart from, because I don't count guitar making as a real job. It's not a real job. It's still a hobby. But my only ever real job was designing tape recorders, mostly audio and digital tape recorders. And all this was, and seismology. I did a lot of work in seismology. All this was vibrations. And one way or another, I found ways of applying all these things all in one direction. And the guitar is an amalgamation of the training, my interest in timbre, interest in music, interest in making things, in the people. I began to meet the people that were involved. And it all sort of jellies into an acoustic guitar. And I can't say I always like it or always enjoy it, but I do love it.
So what I really appreciate about this podcast about luthiers is that our own Elizabeth Dale took the time to go through our collection of the many luthiers that we have interviewed over the years and found 5 really, really good ones. I'm really happy about this. So we got to hear from Scott Baxendale earlier, Bob Benedetto, and Roger Bucknall just there. We have 2 more to go for our introduction, and the next is a really well-known luthier named Wayne Charvel, who started Charvel Guitars back in 1978. and made guitars for all of the hair metal bands of the era, including one for Randy Rhoads, and worked very, very exclusively for Eddie Van Halen for a very long time, and continues to make guitars for Eddie under the guitar company name Wayne Guitars. So Wayne's a great guy. He's always at the NAMM show, and it's really exciting to have the opportunity to share some of his stories. And he's going to talk a little bit about how there was music in his house when he was growing up.
My dad played banjo and guitar, and when I was 5 years old, he gave me this old beat-up guitar, and I started noodling around on it. And we grew up, we didn't have a lot of money. I was an only child. And I remember the first time we went to Hollywood, my dad was going to buy me an acoustic guitar. We got all the way down there and he couldn't afford it. And so that's kind of how I had such a desire to learn, because my dad had musician friends come around. And my dad actually played a few times with the famous banjo player Eddie Peabody, which, you probably haven't heard of him, but he was kind of like the Chet Atkins of banjo players.
That's right.
And so,
King of the banjo, they used to call him.
Pardon me?
They used to call him the king of the banjo.
Exactly. And so I had such a desire to play guitar that I thought, well, if I can't afford one, I'll build one. Well, finally, when I got about, I think it was 17 or so, had a job, I went down and bought a brand new Fender Strat and a Tremolux Tweed amp. Both of them for $500. I made payments on them, but I got real interested, and then I tore it apart and painted it, which is I wished I still had it, but you learn from it. I tore it apart and painted it. Then other guys would see that I could paint, and pretty soon I was doing metal flake, and it just kind of slowly evolved into fixing guitars, and then saying, well, hey, I think I can make one of these. And so that, as a matter of fact, that neck that you have over there, I made that when I was about 11 or 12. It's horrible, Alan Hamill, a good friend of mine, that he worked in the custom shop at Fender for a long time. We started a little school to teach people how to build and repair guitars. And it was funny because you get students and they'd say, oh man, I wish I could do this. This is really cool. And I said, well, you got to start somewhere, You're a baby at one time, nothing. And I used to show them that neck. And they'd look at it and say, this is terrible. I said, that's my first neck, You got to start somewhere. And then you just, the whole idea is to be persistent. If you really want to do something, you just keep going at it, and you make mistake after mistake after mistake. Pretty soon, you finally get it. And then it becomes a joy, because now you can make something pretty darn nice, I don't think you ever make anything perfect. But so that's how I kind of got started in doing it. And then we played in surf bands. Dick Dale was one of my heroes. And I didn't meet Dick Dale for years later, but we used to go to the Rendezvous Ballroom and see Dick Dale play. And he was playing a Fender Strat, upside down, backwards strung, and a Fender Showman amp with one, I didn't know at the time, that big shiny 4-inch cone. I didn't know that was a JBL. And the next time we saw him, he had two of those. And whoa. But he was kind of like I think Dick Dale was kind of like the king of the beginning of heavy metal. He was the original heavy metal guy, played really loud and just an amazing guy, really nice guy. I've since, talked to him several times. And he's got a son that's Jimmy Dale, who's playing guitar now. But so there you go.
And the final introduction we're going to be making today of these 5 luthiers is Bill Collings, who was born in 1948, and we just lost in July of 2017. So sad day in the music products industry.
Absolutely.
And Bill started his own company, the Collings Guitar Company, in Austin, Texas, back in 1973. So we're very excited to have his story part of our collection, and we're going to be hearing about kind of his roots and music in his house growing up.
I understand your dad was an engineer. Did you have a lot of music in your house when you were growing up?
Well, he listened to jazz, a lot of the 30s, 40s, and 50s jazz bands, yeah. But I wouldn't say I was into that, but they were, my dad was.
Did he play?
No, he played a little piano, hot rod piano or something like that. That's about it. But my mother played. She was never heard her much, but she did the whole classical piano thing until she's probably 35 or so. So she knew all that. Even till a couple of years ago, she'd come over and just pick up any music and just play away. It was pretty amazing. Really? So, I mean, yeah, she had a little bit. But I didn't have any talent, if that's what you're getting at. Do I play? No. They did a little bit. Probably about the same amount, not too much for me. Really? Yeah.
So your interest was more in the engineering?
No, I was fascinated with the sound of guitar, as a kid when guitar, I'd first start hearing it on the radio back in the 50s, that's neat, and I guess a lot of people figured that, it was the switch from the horn to the guitar, I think, and rock and roll and, hearing all that stuff kind of thrilled me. And wondered what that was and thought it'd be pretty cool to be able to play, but never had the opportunity until I was about 12 or 13 to actually even see a guitar in person, and play it and hold it. So in that respect, I was a little old, I think, Today, kids are doing it, 4 years old, and it's different. But it became accepted in those years, too. So where piano was probably the instrument of choice for the household, now guitars are everywhere, and so it's a little different.
So what do you remember about playing that guitar?
I remember just hearing, picking a string and just having that sound and something about it, and how neat it was. I didn't know how to do the next note, but just that was good, and just always liked it, Never had any lessons and all that, but people in the neighborhood, like an old guy, had a couple Spanish guitars, whatever those were, and there might have been 5 strings on them, all rusted, but they were cheap guitars of some sort that were made in the time. And I would try to figure out the chords with this guy a little bit and learn some chording back then, but that was my start. And then probably 14 or 15, I tricked my parents into getting a guitar. I said, well, I'll just pretend I'm interested in classical music so we can get a classical guitar. Not knowing that I wanted a hot rod of a guitar, but that classic guitar, it was, $125, and I talked them into, let's go get that guitar. So that got it going a little bit. Trickery. I didn't care much about classical music. But it was a beginning, so, and that started it all. I bought and traded many guitars. At that when I could find something, or learn to play a little bit and finger pick, all that. But that was the beginning.
So now that we've introduced all of the luthiers that we'll be hearing from in this podcast today, we're going to hear again from Scott Baxendale about his first instrument and building his first guitar in the 4th grade.
When did you pick up your first instrument? Was it the guitar?
Well, it's when I saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. And then this was I was in the 4th grade. And I actually built the guitar then because me and 3 of my friends started a band called the Shaggy Dogs. But it wasn't a real band. I mean, I made cardboard guitars with fake strings on them, and we had Beatle wigs and Beatle boots, and we went around to all the 4th grade and 5th grade classes, and we sang all these Beatles songs, but we changed all the words so that they referred to dogs, like "I want to hold your paw" and stuff like that. And so I actually built those guitars for everybody in the band. I cut out the cardboard and glued these like buttons on for knobs and stuff and painted them and all that sort of thing. And, without kind of knowing that was what I was going to be doing later. Yeah. And But I started playing. I never really took it seriously until like maybe my last year of high school. I started to get more serious about playing. And then when I got to college, and my friend that I jammed with, his name was John Boyd, and me and John were roommates, and he had bought a Martin D28, and by that time I had got my first really good guitar, which was a Gibson J185, and we started jamming all the time, and we were just, it was like what we were just compelled to do every day. And my desire then was just to be a musician and be able to somehow survive doing that. And so then after that the Mossman opportunity came up, and I thought, well, this is my way of doing it. So
all right, so moving on to kind of our next topic, we're going to be hearing from our luthiers about building their first guitar or instrument, so kind of narrowing down that focus in the shop to now producing instruments. So who are we going to hear from first?
Looks like we're going to hear from Bill Collings again, and he's going to be talking about when he decided to start making guitars and what his first guitars were like.
And when did you start having the idea of actually making a guitar? Where did that come from?
Well, for me, it didn't come. I'd made, because I didn't have a guitar before I even had that classical guitar. I made like cigar box guitars. I think a lot of kids did. I don't even know where the idea came from, but rubber bands on it, and doing all that. And I remember some contraption there, and I could actually play a little bit on it. Not much, but because it was hard for me to actually play a chord and then make the next notes or whatever they would be. I'm still stuck on those chords where other people be all over playing, but learn little bits in here at friends' houses or whatever. And I'd play it on that little rubber band thing. So that was the first. But then after buying several guitars, like in and out of college and in that area, and cheap ones, the best one I ever bought was a Gibson Dove for $225. I bought it because it was cracked in the music store, and they wanted $400 for it. And I told I'd fix it, but it was cracked because it was Cleveland, Ohio, and it was dried up. But I bought that guitar, and I thought that was great. It sounded awful, absolutely awful. Everybody that played it thought it was just the worst thing they ever heard. But I didn't know what that was. Why was it so bad? What were they hearing, Because I didn't have much to compare it to. But as I got better, learned there's different tones, and bought more guitars, got real curious about it, started looking at the guitar, and I was probably 20 in that area, and just kind of got interested in what it was. And through the years, the next few years, I'd maybe make a neck or something. I worked in a machine shop when I got out of college, so I could just look at something and make it or whatever, and just got into it, So but by the time I was 25, that's what I did. I made guitars. So it went from making metal parts to making guitars, and just figured it out.
Now, did you make those early guitars for particular people, or just to make
Well, when you first get going, you'd love to have people play them, but you make it because your own interest gets you going. And one problem was, if you went to a music store and you wanted to play that guitar, the people wouldn't really want to say, oh, I'm going to let you play that guitar. That's the way music stores were to me. That was kind of like, I wasn't a great musician, so I wasn't going to be handed that guitar to play, and I'd kind of look at it and walk out of the store. So that's still true somewhat today, but not as much as it was. I mean, there was 3 guitars on the wall. Oh, those are the special guitars, So, you know what I'm getting at? Well, and honestly, that might have been one reason I made guitars. I wanted a good guitar, but I wasn't, I didn't know how you got them. You had to pay money for those things. And then around 71 or 2, this friend of mine bought a Martin. It was after some early John Prine stuff, and I think it was 72, somewhere in there, and I'm going, wow, that was $400 for that guitar. It was pretty neat, and, oh yeah, it doesn't sound good today, he told me, but it will when they get old. I said, wow, that's kind of weird. What's that all about? I didn't understand that, but that was the first, oh, so that's what these people tell them when they're buying these guitars. Well, actually, it was probably a pretty good guitar. It was a little mahogany triple O, from what I remember. And it was probably, to this day, a pretty good guitar. But that was in Martin's boom, I think, when they made a lot of guitars. Mm. 20,000 a year, something at that time, because of the folk boom. But right in that period, I was introduced to more guitars, and for some reason, I was interested in fancy stuff like banjos and adornment, and wondered how they did it. So I would look around for the materials and call around and ask questions. It might have been early 70, 71, hard to say. But in my quest, remember I was working in this machine shop, I ran across a pattern maker, and the pattern maker would supply me with wood because they used to make patterns for foundries. Now they don't do it that way as much anymore. But I learned that. And then what to do with this neck, or how do I make it, I would ask around. You don't go to the hardware store and ask them. You had to find someone who was already tinkering with it. But I ended up calling a guy named Doug Unger, who lived about 20 miles south of me in Brecksville, Ohio. And he started talking about how you look down the neck and the grain runs all this way, and go, oh yeah, trying to figure it all out. And remember that conversation, so I'm trying to tell this pattern maker how to cut this wood. Oh, yeah. But that's all guitar making is. You just learn one thing, learn the next. Funny thing is, this guy, Doug Unger, back then knew a lot about banjos, did earlier banjo stuff. And this year, turns out that Doug Unger did a bunch of inlay for us in Boston on our 40th anniversary guitars we made for Music Emporium. And it was like, wow, I haven't even talked to him about it yet. That this was the first guy I ever talked about instruments. And now we're doing this, so it was pretty neat. And you did great job on the inlay, but that's how we learned making guitars back then. We just talked and talked to other people who started doing it. So the funny thing, he's still doing it and still well known at it. But I hadn't heard from about this guy since that conversation. It might have been 69 or so. I can't remember exactly. And here we are 40 years later and grouped up again. That was kind of neat. So that's how I got going. Okay. And that was a pretty neat time because there was no pressure to make guitars. I was just making it happy for myself.
And next up we have Bob Benedetto talking about some of his early shape designs and the wood he liked to use early in his career, and the first guitar he actually made money on, which is pretty important.
Did you study some of the designs of other guitars early on?
No, I really didn't. At that point in my life, I was a little kid, and that was the only guitar I'd ever seen or touched. And so my uncle Mike, who was the artist of the family and the guitar player, immediately saw my interest in his guitar, and he took me aside and showed me the guitar itself, explained how it worked, vibrations and strings and wood. And I was just interested in making one.
That's neat. One of the cool things about, I think, that experience is you didn't have what some other people create in terms of barriers? You know, with this, it was sort of approachable to you even as a young age that you could make this instrument.
Oh, it was approachable. It was encouraged. You know, it was not, because everybody in my family, my mother's side as well, not just on my father's side, they were all artistic, very, very creative people. And if any one of us had interest to do whatever that may be, whether it's build a tree fort in the fort, we used to call them forts, the tree house in the woods, or make a guitar, we were encouraged to do so. Yeah.
Did you ever have aspirations that, did you have thoughts that this idea would lead to what it's led to?
I knew it would.
Really?
Always.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's all I ever had in mind, was making guitars for great players and being the #1 arch top maker in the world. I mean, whether I achieve that or not is not even the issue. The point is that was my goal.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And later on, as you started developing this concept, what were the challenges that you had to overcome? Like getting your raw materials, figuring out how you were going to do it differently, financially. How was that all set up?
There was no formal approach. There was very little thought, in fact, that went into it. All I knew was that when I wanted to make my first real guitar, not the little miniatures, but a playable instrument for myself, because at the time I was playing out, I just decided to make it. Never gave it much thought. The tools, as far as I was concerned, I had all the tools I needed, which were my grandfather's cabinet making planes and chisels, gouges, and so on. Raw materials, I cut up the kitchen table, and that became the wood. That was my source of wood for the first few guitar necks. Eventually I realized I needed sources of wood and tuning machines and cases and so on. But I would just deal with those issues as I had to. I didn't worry about them. I didn't try to plan too far ahead. I just focused on making that one guitar. After the one, then I focused on making the next 2 guitars. And it kind of geometrically moved on.
That's interesting. That first guitar, that's the one that has the neck from the kitchen table?
That one, and the second, third, and fourth. I think about the first 5 or 6 guitars had pieces of the kitchen table. And my sister's bed. When I ran out of wood from the kitchen table, I cut up my sister's bed and used that. My cousin's bed. And by then I found wood sources.
Yeah, luckily, or the whole house was living on.
My family was delighted. In fact, one of the very first source of wood that I located was in New York City. H.L. Wild. Wildwood was the name of the company. He was one of the suppliers to John D'Angelico. And when I found him, I bought his last 2 European sets, which is cello making wood, and those I used for the 2 instruments. And then I began to find other sources of that same wood. I also found sources for domestic woods. And then I started buying wood from Europe directly. I kind of had a lot of stepping stones. One led to another. And I stockpiled as I was able to.
Do you still have your first guitar?
I do.
Really?
I do.
Still play it?
No. I hide it.
Don't want anyone to see it, huh? When you look back at that first guitar, what in there do you now see as sort of your trait? Is your style even present in that first guitar, or did you have to develop that?
It probably is there. Even that, I haven't really given that much thought, but there's always been a kind of a draw. I've always been drawn towards a delicate, little squiggly, curly ornamentation, but not overly done.
Do you remember the first guitar that you made money on?
Yeah, second one.
The second one?
Number 2. I sold it. It was custom made for a player in New Jersey. I made a lot of money on that guitar. I thought I did anyway.
Because it was your mother's kitchen table.
Right? The neck was, yeah.
And when did your career get to the point where you started getting your reputation amongst jazz guitarists?
It happened fast, real fast. Again, because I was focused on the jazz guitar, every place I went I was accepted. The guitars were accepted. Even if they weren't right, really right, and even if not everybody liked them, enough of the playing community liked them enough where I was able to move forward, making progress. So, not that I was an overnight success, but again, I had no competition. Doors opened. As I began acquiring well-known endorsers, that was a big advantage, of course. I don't know, I mean, there really wasn't a particular time or date when suddenly it all happened.
Okay, so next up, following Bob Benedetto there is Scott Baxendale. We'll talk a little bit more about the beginning of his instrument building career, including the first guitar that he made. And interestingly enough, Scott is also, as we're going to hear a little bit later on, worked with the Mossman Company, and I think it's really important in this segment to hear a little bit about his philosophy of building guitars, because that, of course, became sort of the hallmark of his approach later on in his career. So back to Scott Baxendale.
When was the first Baxendale instrument made? Was that?
Yeah, that was in 1994, maybe 93 or 94.
That must have been exciting.
Yeah. After being out of it for a while, though, it took me a while, a few instruments, I think, to get back to where I was. And so it was a struggle at first. And I added some other changes to my guitars that I didn't change when I had the Mossmans, because the jigs and the fixtures, for instance, like the neck joint. My neck joint now is like a Martin dovetail, where before it was a mortise and tenon joint with the Mossman guitars. The heel still looks the same, but it's if you take it all apart, it's different on the inside. And my truss rod's a little different. My bridge now is a little different, and that's so.
And last but not least, for the topic of building their first instruments, we're going to hear again from Roger Bucknall about how his first guitar influenced him to continue making guitars.
I remember that first guitar. It was pink. It had flowers on it, and I had a fishing line for strings. And I made it for an exhibition of the Boy Scouts. I don't think it actually played. But something clicked somewhere. I'd made this thing, and I realised you could make a noise by pulling on a piece of string, basically. So I had bought for me a very cheap acoustic guitar. And then at one point, I must have been about 15, I'd already made another guitar by then. But I went into a second-hand shop, what we call a pawn shop. Not that sort of pawn shop, it's where you pawn something, you take it in part exchange. And there was a Gibson 335 on the wall, and it was the prettiest thing I'd ever seen. And it had bits of metal on that you could adjust and things, so it was an engineering device as well as a musical instrument. And I loved this, and I pined for it for various weeks. And then I went back into this shop, and it had gone. So I hadn't bought it. And that was a turning point, because up to that point, I'd been quite happy with acoustic guitars. And at that point, I began to show an interest in something else. I had a bit more engineering involved with it. But the opportunity went, and my path turned back towards the acoustic and stayed there. And it's just the way that my life went in meeting people. I began to meet musicians, watching them at the back of the club. And then meeting them bit by bit, helping to organise a folk club, booking the artists, talking to them backstage. And the first time somebody actually said, "You made that? Will you make me one?" "Oh, wow, yes." And that's more or less the way it's still going on, 50 years later. "Will you make me one?" "Yeah, okay, yeah." So
Next, we're going to be moving into hearing from the guys talking about starting of their kind of quote-unquote official careers within the luthier industry. And first up, we have Scott Baxendale, as Dan mentioned earlier, and he's going to reflect on joining Mossman and finding his direction while he was a college student.
I saw an opportunity. I was kind of at a crossroads because the gymnastic thing didn't really work out as far as getting a scholarship. And I was in a fraternity house, and me and one of my friends, we played acoustic guitars, and it was right when Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young were really big. And every day after classes, we'd get together and jam for 2 or 3 hours, and we started learning. We were compelling each other to learn more and to become players, and we started just really getting into it. And then that was around the time when the Circle Being Broken album came out, and we got really heavy into that, and that led us into Doc Watson. And so we were like all excited about Doc Watson's music, and we started going to like the little folk festivals and music festivals around. And I remember going to Eureka Springs, Arkansas, and seeing Doc and Merle Watson and the Earl Scruggs Review and all that sort of stuff. And even though we had been heavily into, the rock music of the time, Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, we really got into this, Americana kind of music. And that was all about the time when I was really struggling with what I wanted to do in life. And I knew I wanted to be into music, but I didn't really have the book knowledge to go into the music program at the university. I mean, I didn't know how to read music or anything like that. I mean, I was just a guitar player. And so this opportunity came along, and it was just like a light bulb went off and said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And it worked out. I went down there, and I took to it right away. I mean, I picked up on I had the aptitude for it, I think. And I started in the finish department, which was kind of the worst job, sanding and spraying lacquer. And after a while, then Mossman's had a big fire, and after the fire, they rebuilt the factory, and then I was promoted to like an assistant shop foreman at that time, and that was like the following summer. And
so you were making $250.
Yeah, I think when I left there, I was making $350 was my wages when I left.
What's really interesting to me about the way Elizabeth has put this podcast together is these segments of each of these 5 luthiers talking about the development of their careers. And we're moving on from Scott Baxendale to Wayne Charvel. And what's great is these early days of these guys' careers and how they got one job that led to another that led to a reputation. So let's hear from Wayne Charvel.
When I look at your the neck that's in the museum down there, mm-hmm. I don't really see it the same way you do. I see it as, wow, for a young kid, you certainly have a lot of ideas that were original, because necks weren't being made like that.
No, thank God, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know. And then I worked, after I got married, I quit playing in bands, and a couple of my good friends at Fender knew that I was painting guitars, so Fender hired me to do all the out-of-warranty repairs, because they didn't want to take guys off the line when a guitar came in scratched up and take them off and stop production to refinish and sand them down. So I got all that. So I started painting and refretting necks and painting, refinishing necks. And then they found out I could cover amplifiers, so I started covering those Fender Rhodes pianos that came in all scratched up. So it was great for me. I was swamped. And I'd go down to Fender at least twice a week. And then Steve Bollinger, who passed on, real good friend of mine, he worked there for a long time. Then he worked for Jackson for a while, then he went back to Fender. He went in the custom shop. Really a brilliant guy. he'd love it when I come over because it gave him an excuse kind of to goof off for a little bit, and he would take me over to the main plant, and I'd get to meet everybody, Babe Simone and all those guys, and watch them make Fender guitars and learn how they painted them. I was using lacquer, nitrocellulose lacquer. They were using Easy Buff polyester from Den Edwards. And so I learned a lot just by watching them. They used overhead pin routers. Everything was made, by hand. They didn't have CNC machines in those days. And it was just great to see all those guitars. And it was just so exciting, so motivating. And then I thought, these Fender guitars are cool, but I bet they'd really, look great in exotic woods. So I started getting some exotic wood, and then my junior high school buddy Lynn Ellsworth taught him how to make guitars. He opened a company called Boogie Bodies in Washington, did the tooling up, and made a few guitars. And then we had the guy from, his name was Boffin, I believe, from Deep Purple came by one day, and Fender was sending me all these rock and roll stars. So I started building wild guitars. Alan Rogan, that worked for Paul McCartney for a while, he came over and bought some stuff from us, and so the name kind of got out there, because in those days, you have to remember, nobody was taking a Fender guitar and putting a humbucking pickup in it. Nobody was flattening the fingerboard and putting jumbo frets like we were. So we were like ahead of everybody. And I did it because I worked nightclubs for so long and realized that those Fender half-volt pickups didn't cut it. I wanted to get that sustain. So you put a Gibson pickup, humbucking's about 1.5 volts, and give you that a lot of ring and sustain. So I learned, to do those, and guys loved them. So I thought, the next step, let's make bodies, and the next step was make necks. Hooked up with Dave Schechter, who's a real genius. He taught me a lot of things, and Dave and I made 100 bodies in one weekend at his shop in Reseda. And that's how I learned how to make bodies. And then it was great. It was really a lot of fun. And Dave since then sold Schechter. I think a fellow from Japan owns it now. But so the times were really exciting and really ripe. And had I had a little bit more business savvy, I could have really turned it into something bigger. And what happened, various companies saw my ad in the magazine all the time, and they started coming out with parts made offshore, and that killed the parts business because they could sell them for half the price. And so the only thing that I could do that they couldn't do was make guitars. So I thought, okay, they're going to steal the parts business. That's okay. That's life in the big city. I'll make guitars. And that's how that thing came about. It was almost, everything's kind of a blessing in life, but you don't realize it till afterwards. It was a blessing they stole the parts because it got me into making guitars. Otherwise, I'd have probably stayed just making parts. Not that there was anything wrong with that, but it's more fun making guitars. And then Seymour Duncan, he and I are old friends, and I sold him, I think, his first drill press, and so we'd buy pickups. We still buy pickups from Seymour, and I remember when Larry DiMarzio got started, and Seymour and all those guys, they've done exceptionally well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, nobody was doing aftermarket parts. I was the only guy. My first part was and the way this came about, Nick Hanich from Hanich Music came down and said, can you make some square jack plates for the Gibson Les Paul, because the original ones are plastic and they constantly break. So I made 11 of them by hand, because I was kind of a halfway machinist at the time too. So I made those by hand, and I got to thinking, if he wants these, and he ordered some more, I thought maybe I'll put these on in Guitar Player magazine. At that time, Bud Eastman, who we became friends, he's no longer with us, but he owned Guitar Player magazine at that time. And so I put an ad in for the jack plates, and they were $2.50. And then I thought, let's make a tremolo bar, vibrato bar for the Strat, out of stainless steel because it's 4 times as strong. Because those were always breaking, and you have to get in there with an easy out, try to get them out. So I made those, and I had a few other parts, and it still wasn't only bringing about $100, $200 a month. And I said, I don't even want to mess with this. So I asked my wife, do you want some extra money? You do the correspondence and do the shipping, and I'll have the parts made. And then I thought, you know what? Why not add pick guards? So we did brass pick guards, chrome pick guards, gold-plated pick guards, and pretty soon we got a line of parts. Before you know it, we're doing like $16,000, $18,000 a month just in parts. And we added bodies and then necks and so forth. And so it just kind of, bloomed after that. So.
Now, what was the manufacturer's response to what you were doing?
You mean like Fender?
Yeah.
They didn't seem to mind that we made aftermarket parts. I was still doing refinish work. They were so happy to have somebody refinish their guitars because I'd go down there and get 8 or 9 guitars a week that customers would bring in, and they had that polyester. You could not use paint remover to get it off. You had to sand it off. We used heat guns after a while to do it, but you had to watch the end grain. The wood had split, so made a few mistakes on that, but they were so happy to have me do that. And plus, I could recover amps. Then later, went in partners with Ray Ortega, and I came up with the idea, let's come out with tweed guitar cases again, because nobody's doing those. And that was just when the vintage retro thing was starting to kind of blossom. So we came out with those, and we did pretty well, and we got knocked off. But we had the material, so I was covering the old 410 Basemans and shooting lacquer on it. And the original Fender amps used proxylene, which was basically lacquer. Most guys think it's lacquer, but it had something else in it. And they'd shoot it on and sand it and then shoot it so it had a smooth finish. And so I did tons of those Basemans, and all anything that was tweed, except cases. I didn't cover cases, but so we had the original cases from the guy Sid Handler. Was the guy that from it's G&G quality case now. Ben Germain owns that, and we still buy cases from him.
Is that right?
Yeah, great company.
One thing that's definitely important when creating an instrument and starting a brand out is developing your own style, and we're going to hear from Roger Bucknall on how he accomplished that.
Like nearly everybody else, I do use the X-Brace, and I acknowledge Martin for that. Absolutely. Without Martin guitars, most modern guitar makers wouldn't be working. On the wall just on the other side of the workshop here, I have a little row of guitar soundboards that I've made over the years, and I've rescued from the guitars that have become damaged. And you can see the progression of the bracing. And in my early days, I started with part of an X-Brace and part of the Spanish fan system, and then began to discover that this did or didn't do certain things and modified it. And I moved along the lines of lattice bracing, double X, this is all in the 1970s, and began to install what was the forerunner of A-frame, which is 2 strong legs braced up against the tension of the strings, which has been used elsewhere, but it's something I started using in the 70s. And bit by bit, I've come back round to, although I'm still maintaining the concept of the A-frame in the top. It's not. I didn't invent the word A-frame, that was George Loudon. But the shape there is something that I've always been strongly allied with. Keeping the X-Brace from Martin, and currently quite a lot of what other people call the tone bars. I don't like the idea of tone bar, because I think every brace is a tone bar. They're not just 2 or 3 bits of wood glued there to make tone. That's not the way I see it at all. Complete fallacy. But there's lots of similarities between my bracing and Martin, apart from where I reinforce from the neck down just past the sound hole. That's me. That's engineering. And I think if the makers of old, luthiers, I don't like the word luthier, but if the makers of old had been Isambard Kingdom Brunel, an engineer, they would have changed the concept of the bracing of the guitar where it really counted in those weak points. But they've got the soundboard structure elsewhere pretty good. And the difference between mine and Martin and other people that use the X-brace is the way I shape the braces. And I like to shape them not just in scalloped forms, because I think that's just a very hit and miss. All you're doing there is taking mass and stiffness away and allowing volume and bass. Every time you take wood away, you take mass away from the bracing of the guitar. You're encouraging volume and you're encouraging bass response. You're doing no good at all to anything else. You're doing nothing for the middle and treble. You're probably destroying it, and you're doing nothing for balance between the tones. So a simple scalloping in the middle, which is the way many makers go, is a bit of a red herring. I like to shape the braces rather more intelligently. I don't mean that badly, but it's a word I would use with more thought. And the shape of the bracing comes out more like a baseball bat, or like a fishing rod, or a billiard cue. All these things that are based on vibration. The contact between the club and the ball, it's vibration. And it goes back to where I have a pretty close understanding. I've actually made cricket bats, I've made fishing rods. Upstairs I have the willow clefts for bats, and I have the split cane for fishing rods. I've been into all this. And the way that you can transfer a large amount of energy at one end of a piece of wood and not absorb the shock at the other end is the same sort of logic that we're using in a billiard cue, cricket bat, table tennis, etc. It's the same physical theory as in an acoustic guitar. You're trying to convert a small vibration into a big vibration. The guitar is a transformer. It's not an amplifier. You're trying to transform the vibration of a very small, very thin metal string into something you can hear with the human ear. And you do that by attaching it to a big, soft sheet of material which vibrates very easily. That's the structure of a guitar, to make you hear the sound of the string amplified. But to maintain the physics and the engineering of the guitar, we have to get inside and build this structure, build this bridge inside, which allows the soundboard to support that pull of the strings up to £200 for a lifetime and not fall apart. And for the whole of that lifetime, from day one, it has to sound good. If it doesn't sound good on day one, no one's going to buy it. It's no use buying a guitar thinking that'll be good in 10 years' time. We might be dead. It has to sound good, which is a bit of a problem, because really most sensible guitar makers know their guitar is going to get better with age, and they really would like to sell it when it's 10 years old. But then it's not the way it works. We have to make a living for that 10 years.
And finally, rounding out this segment, we're going to hear from the late Bill Collings on how his company progressed and grew.
It was a slow and really painful process. Every person that we'd hire, be it the first one, which was 1987, would be hard because, I could do that job, but here we are, one-on-one, and we're doing half as much or much less with the first person. So you'd have to hopefully give that guy something to do while you could do something and answer the phone and take care of him at the same time, which spreads you pretty thin. And what happens is you get a couple of guys, and then it starts to take a little pressure from that situation. It gets a little better, and then maybe a little more, gets a little better, and then it all falls apart. Then you have to go fix it, group it, and make it, redo it. So that's the way what we did. The thing was, Bruce, who was actually my second employee, he's here today, was really a hard train. Just awful. But when he got it, he really did. And I learned maybe Bruce was a hard train because I was a bad trainer. Don't know. But there's a little of all of that, But now, when Bruce trains, he knows both sides of it, and he gets a little better, and he might leave a lot for granted. So that's the hardest part. It's how you train it. But what was the question, like how did it grow?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it kept being that way. Like we get a guy. You try to balance what you're making to what you sell. Well, that was all over the map because we didn't know what we would sell. And it was Bruce and I think, and one more guy, and we got a call from a store. Maybe it's George Gruen, okay? That would have been 86 and 87. And we were going to make guitars. And he wanted to make guitars in his name, Gruen. I said, why don't we put Collings Gruen? Because, nobody knows you. They know me. And they wouldn't sell with your name on it. I said, oh, okay. Well, how about if I put my name inside? You could sign the label. Okay. So he said, we'll make 25 guitars. I said, okay, I'll make them. And started making these guitars. And we'd call up, so we're shipping this guitar. We ship us the money so we can eat, all this sort of stuff. Just kept going. And anything you do, we needed that paycheck, period. That day or that week or the week before or whatever it was to keep it going. And every week it seemed like there'll be no week tomorrow. It's not, we didn't have work lined up, but hopefully by the end of the week something would happen. Because now we're trying to roll. We're not trying to just make one and sell it. We're trying to say, let's make one and keep it going. And we had no buffer. So the buffer was right to the store or right to the person. That was it. So this 25 orders was a pretty good deal. Because, wow, we could just kind of learn how to make these guitars. And that's what Bruce and I did together. And I think we got up to about number 7. And I said, George, I'm going to send this guitar tomorrow. Can you send us money? He goes, I don't have any money. I said, what? He goes, yeah, I just paid my taxes and I got all screwed up and I'm out of money. I said, but your name's on these guitars. Wow, what am I going to do? Well, I don't know. And I was pissed, okay, because I put all my eggs in one basket. At that same time, there was an earthquake. It was the San Francisco earthquake. And I think it was 10th of October or something like that.
Right, 89.
89.
Yeah.
That might have been when that was. And I remember it because we're, shit, okay. I said, oh, cool, maybe Santa Cruz lost all their guitars up there. Good, because that was my rival. But I got a call. I said, Bruce, we'll just rip that name off those guitars and we'll re-inlay it. We'll put my name on it. We'll try to sell those guitars. I got a call from George in the morning. He said, I'm really sorry. I borrowed the money from my parents. And I'm sorry that I did that and I was wrong. I went, wow, this guy has integrity. After all, I thought, I'm glad I didn't rip those out. And it kept going. So we did like 25 guitars. It was a great relationship. We had a good time. But it was great advertising for me. He couldn't give those guitars away, but I sold guitars because of those guitars. So that helped out a lot. It gave me a lot of credibility. And at that same time, we took on a store called Griffin out in San Francisco, or Palo Alto. And they said, well, how do we order guitars? I said, just order a guitar. Okay, good, okay. We'll send them that guitar. And a couple of weeks later, send them the guitar. He goes, oh, okay, well, how do we order another guitar? Just order the guitar. So that's kind of how we got going. And the word of mouth helped a lot. And George Gruen probably most of all helped more than probably anybody in that credibility stage, And I figured we sold 12 guitars to Palo Alto and it'd be over. Then we moved to another city. I didn't know how you did it. Oh, okay, we'll do that and we'll go. They'll be full of guitars, at that time. Little I know that next year they did 50 guitars. I thought next year 50 guitars. I go, that's one a week. I'm going, well, we took another little store on. It would have been George, or someone, I forget who or where, and little things like that. Just kind of allowed us to balance it and keep moving.
All right, so we're going to round out the podcast here, and our last segment is, I think, very fitting to end, and that's we're going to have both Bob Benedetto and Roger Bucknall reflect on some lessons they've learned and give us some advice that they have from their long careers as luthiers. So if you are out there thinking, you know what, I hate my job, I'd like to build guitars or other stringed instruments, listen to these guys and maybe you can be successful. Who are we going to hear from first? Mike?
Looks like Bob Benedetto first, followed by Roger Bucknall.
I think the biggest lesson I learned early on was I used hide glue. There were different glues, of course, different wood glues available to us. The industry standard these days, and which has been for a number of years, is a Franklin Tight Bond. It's an alphatic resin glue that you can buy it in a hardware store. It's great stuff. Well, at one point in time, I was influenced, in the early years, I was influenced a lot by violin making. They use hide glue to assemble a violin because hide glue reacts violently to moisture and climate change. By violently, that's an advantage. You can open up a glue joint on a violin. You could separate the entire instrument with the right probe and pull, or with heat and moisture. The glue softens, or it becomes brittle depending on how you want to approach it, and you can break that joint. Violins are made to be disassembled. Guitars are not made to be disassembled. So, early on, I thought I was doing the right thing by gluing the necks to the bodies using hide glue. That wasn't so bad. I didn't have any difficulty there because my joints were so good that no problem, okay? But I also glued the fingerboards to the neck. That's where I learned the lesson, gluing the fingerboards to the neck with hide glue. Well, on about 6 guitars, I did that, and I was shipping them out of state to hot climates. And the climates on occasion, especially if the player wasn't really careful where he put his guitar, maybe in the trunk of a car for a few days while he's traveling down the desert, and well, it got so hot that the glue would soften and the joint would begin to slip, or the fingerboard would begin to peel away from the neck, and so there were problems there. I was made aware of that, took the guitars back, of course, and fixed them with the proper glue, and that was that. That was probably the biggest lesson I ever learned. No catastrophe. It was an easy fix.
I don't talk to many other guitar makers. I'm good friends with Stefan Sobel, and I keep in touch with a few others. But the ones I do speak to, the ones that have been doing it for a while, we all come to the same conclusions, in some ways anyway. You get a feel of what's going on as soon as you pick the piece of wood up. Even the handling of it, just the touch of the fingers on the wood, gives you an idea of what that wood has inside it. So you're starting to think, oh, this is a nice piece of wood. And then you'll look at it and you'll think, it's a bit ugly, no one's going to buy that, what a shame. You have no choice to put it down. Yeah. And that's the way you start off with the building of a guitar. But it has an interesting effect, because if ever you want to build a guitar for yourself, or you want to build a guitar to take to the pub at night or play in sessions, or maybe to make for a child who's going to kick it around, then you might well go back to that piece of ugly wood. I can use you now, you know, I can make something out of you, and I'm going to prove that I knew what I was talking about. And you'll make a guitar out of all the ugliest bits of wood that you could come across, something with a knot in the middle of it, or that's been split, or you'd made it a bit too thin but you don't want to throw it away, you know, this sort of thing. And every guitar maker, well, with any experience at all that I've ever spoken to, has always got a story of that guitar he made out of all the junk, and it was the best guitar he'd ever made. So it's a big mixture. Sometimes you can do this with a different line of reasoning. You can deliberately make a guitar out of all the bits of wood that you don't want to use. You can make a guitar out of the bits of the wood that you think will not make a good guitar. The bit of wood that maybe it looks good, but you know it's dead. Or maybe it is dead and it looks horrible. All these things, all the bits of wood you discarded for one reason or another, you don't want to throw them away. Guitar makers hate wasting wood. It's awful wasting a piece of wood. You know, we get a box full of scrap. What can we use it for? You don't like wasting it. So you make a guitar out of all these awful pieces And lo and behold, it's the best guitar you've ever made. And every guitar maker's got stories like this. And the other side of the coin, of course, we've all got stories as well of making guitars out of the best ever pieces of wood, the piece of wood you've paid a fortune for, that looks fantastic, lovely tap tone, stiff as anything you like, and it comes out and it's a terrible disappointment. And that usually happens when, in my experience, the customer has been putting too much on you. He's been saying to you, I want the best ever guitar. Well, we do that every time we make a guitar. We're doing the best we can. We don't turn up every day and say, I'm going to make a half-good guitar today. You know, it's always we're trying to do the best we can. It's useless a customer coming saying, I want your best ever guitar. It can't work. All you're going to do is try to make things a bit lighter, or use the most nice-looking piece of wood, or the most expensive piece of wood, and none of those are factors in the production of a good guitar. The only real factor is the process of the guitar being made from 50 years ago, 100 years ago, to the present day. The development of the design of the guitar and the way it's been done by the people doing it. That's what puts it all together. You've decided that you want the soundboard to be 2.9 millimeters thick. You don't want to make it 2.8 or 3, unless you've got a real reason for doing so with that particular piece of wood. You've decided you want to use an X-brace. You've decided you want to use a certain sort of joint. What more can you do when a customer comes to you and says, I want the best ever guitar? Well, that's what I'm going to do anyway. You know, it's fascinating. There's a lot of human interaction in this. And also, of course, the customer asked to pick his favourite guitar from a range of guitars on show. One person will go for guitar A, and he won't like guitar B at all, yet your second customer will be completely the other way around. It's psychoacoustics again. You try and make the guitars the best you can, and then you try and match the guitar to the customer. That's the best way of doing it. And if you have a musician come through a door and spot a guitar, has happened a few times with me from the other side of the room, and the guitar is calling to him. Martin Carthy tells this story, Dick Gotten tells this story. They see a guitar and they say it was shouting at him, and they go to it and they pick it up and they bond. The relationship might be difficult for a few years, but they bond instantly, and that guitar stays with them for a lifetime. And that's fantastic. You know, I love it when that happens. It's the personal relationship, not just with me and the wood, but with the artist that's playing it. And I'm so glad to have become so good friends with so many of the people I'm making guitars with. And when we leave here today, we're going home with a wonderful guitarist to come to stay with us for a few days. It's a young lad called Tristan Hume. Lovely guitarist. And we're going to spend some social time with him. And next time Eric Bibb comes across, we promise to get together and spend a day or two. It's the other side of the coin, but it's part of the music.
Well, I'm really delighted that we had the chance to hear from 5 of our luthier friends, all from the NAMM Oral History Collection. Thank you for joining us. And just a last comment from Mike about those who would like to leave a comment and or a suggestion for us.
Yeah, if you're on iTunes, you can head over to the ratings and review tab and rate our podcast out of 5 stars and leave us a review telling us what you like, tell us what you want to hear about. And if you're listening somewhere else, maybe like SoundCloud, you can always just leave a comment right on the podcast.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Dan, you going to say bye?
Bye-bye.